good evening, and a very warm welcome, sweet viewer. Please take this time, find a quiet space, settle in and let the noise of the modern world recede. We are accustomed to a world of sanitation, of sealed pipes and sterile environments, where the unpleasant realities of life are kept far from sight and mind. But the world we are about to enter was different. It was a world that was viscerally, inescapably alive. It was organic, teeming, and loud. And like any living thing, it was often messy, diseased, and foul-smelling. To survive in this world, to keep the great, chaotic organism of a medieval town or city from choking on its own refuse and being consumed by its own pests, required a class of people willing to perform the jobs that no one else would. They were the forgotten laborers, the men and women who lived and worked in the filth and the shadows so that society itself could function. Their jobs were not just strange, they were essential, and they began in the dark. Imagine a city after the sun has set. The gates are barred, the law-abiding citizens are shuttered in their homes, and the only light comes from the moon and the occasional flickering torch carried by the night watch. This is when the work begins. A cart, pulled by a tired horse whose every step is a weary plod, rumbles slowly through the deserted, narrow streets. The air around it is not merely unpleasant, it is a physical presence, a miasma so foul, so overpoweringly putrid that it feels as though it could be cut with a knife. This is the domain of the gong farmer. The name itself is a masterpiece of euphemistic deflection, sounding almost pastoral, connected to the earth and its cycles. But their harvest was the city's dark and terrible secret, the accumulated filth of thousands of human lives. Gong, derived from the Old English gong, a word meaning a going or a drain, was the polite term for human waste. And the gong farmer's field was the cesspit. To comprehend the necessity of the gong farmer, one must first comprehend the medieval city itself. Forget the sanitized images of chivalry and cathedrals. The reality on the ground was a sensory assault. The streets were narrow, unpaved canyons between leaning, timber-framed houses. There were no underground sewer systems as the Romans had once built. The central drainage channel, or kennel, that ran down the middle of the street was an open conduit for every kind of refuse. Household slops, rainwater, the blood and offal from butchers' stalls, the toxic effluent from tanners' yards, and the waste of countless animals. Horses, pigs, chickens that shared the urban space with humans. The stench, known to contemporaries as the Great Stink, was a permanent feature of life, a complex bouquet of decay that residents became inured to, but which would have been physically sickening to a modern nose. It was within this context of pervasive, everyday filth that the problem of human excrement had to be solved. For the poor, the solution was simple. A bucket dumped into the street or the nearest river. For the more affluent, the merchants, the nobles, the monasteries, the solution was the privy or garderobe. This was often a small room projecting from the side of a building with a simple hole in the floor. Below this hole lay the cesspit, a deep, stone-lined well, a subterranean stomach designed to slowly digest the waste of the household. For years, this filth would accumulate. It was a slow rising tide of human effluent mixed with discarded kitchen waste, lost trinkets, and anything else that found its way down the privy shaft. The cesspit was a sealed, anaerobic environment, a dark and forgotten chamber where decomposition occurred at a glacial pace. But eventually, inevitably, it would become full. The rising level of waste would threaten to overspill, or the stench would become so concentrated and noxious that it would seep up through the floorboards, becoming unbearable even for the hardened medieval sensibility. It was at this point that the call would go out, not for a plumber or a sanitation worker, but for the gong farmer, or as he was sometimes more bluntly known, the night man. His profession was governed by strict laws born of public necessity and profound social disgust. A royal decree issued in England in the 14th century, for example, stipulated that no man shall cause dung, filth, or other ordure to be brought or laid in the streets or lanes, but that they be carried and laid in places thereto assigned. More importantly, the law dictated the gong farmer's working hours with absolute precision. He was a creature of the night, legally forbidden from working during the day. His work, his tools, and his very person were considered such an overwhelming public nuisance that he was banished to the shadows. He could only begin his labor after 9 o'clock at night and was required to be finished, his cart and its foul cargo gone from the city, by 5 o'clock in the morning. This legal constraint defined his existence. He was a nocturnal being, his life lived in reverse to the rest of the society he served. So, in the dead of night, the gong farmer and his team, for it was often a job for 2 or 3 men, would arrive at the designated property. They were a vision from a nightmare. Dressed in worn leather or waxed canvas to repel the worst of the filth, they brought their specialized tools: heavy iron hooks to lift the stone cap of the cesspit, thick ropes, sturdy wooden buckets, and broad-headed shovels. Their cart, a simple, functional thing, would wait in the lane, the horse stamping impatiently, the air around it already thick with the ghosts of 1,000 previous jobs. The first task was to open the pit. This itself was heavy labor, requiring immense strength to pry the heavy flagstone from its seating. As the seal was broken, a wave of concentrated foul air would rush out, a gasp from the earth's bowels that could stagger an unseasoned man. Then came the descent. One man, typically the youngest or smallest of the crew, would be lowered on a rope into the Stygian darkness of the pit. He carried a lantern, its flickering candlelight casting grotesque dancing shadows on the slime-coated walls, and a small shovel or scoop. He would be standing, sometimes up to his waist, sometimes up to his neck, in a thick, semi-liquid slurry that was the condensed history of the household's digestion. It was a substance of unimaginable foulness, a substance that clung to the skin, seeped into the clothes, and stained the soul. The man in the pit would begin the back-breaking, stomach-churning work of scooping the night soil into the buckets. Each scoop was a heavy, viscous mass. He had to work quickly, efficiently, his movements practiced and economical. Above him, his partners would haul the filled buckets up, hand over hand, their muscles straining, and dump the contents into the larger tubs on the cart. The work was not just disgusting, it was lethally dangerous, a constant dance with death. The primary danger was asphyxiation. The decomposing waste released a cocktail of toxic gases: hydrogen sulfide, methane, ammonia, and carbon dioxide. In the confined, unventilated space of the cesspit, these gases could accumulate to deadly concentrations. A man could be overcome in an instant, slumping silently into the filth, his lantern extinguished by the lack of oxygen. There are court records and chronicles that tell grim tales of gong farmers who descended into pits and never came back up, their bodies recovered hours later by their horrified comrades. Drowning was another constant threat. A slip on the greasy ladder or a stumble in the murky depths could mean a swift and terrible end, submerged in a substance thicker than water, impossible to fight against. And then there was the ever-present risk of disease. Though the concept of germ theory was centuries away, the connection between filth and sickness was instinctively understood. The gong farmer was perpetually exposed to every pathogen that festered in human waste. The bacteria that caused dysentery, typhoid, cholera, and countless other intestinal diseases. Every cut, every abrasion on his skin was a potential entry point for a fatal infection. He was a man who lived his life immersed in a soup of contagion. For this horrific, dangerous, and socially reviled labor, the gong farmer was, perhaps surprisingly, paid very well. His wages were often significantly higher than those of a skilled artisan, like a carpenter or a stonemason. The price of cleaning a single large cesspit could be enough to support a family for weeks. This was a simple matter of supply and demand. The work was so utterly repellent that few would do it, and those who did could command a premium. But the financial reward came at a terrible social cost. The gong farmer was a pariah, a social outcast. The stench of his trade clung to him like a second skin, a permanent olfactory stain that no amount of washing could ever truly remove. This smell was his brand, the mark of his profession, and it isolated him completely. He and his family were often forced by law or social pressure to live in designated areas on the outskirts of the town, downwind from everyone else. During the day, he was a shunned figure. People would cross the street to avoid him. He would be refused entry to taverns and shops. His children would be taunted and ostracized. He was the ultimate paradox of the medieval city, a man whose work was absolutely essential for the health and comfort of the urban population, yet who was reviled and cast out for the very act of performing it. He was the city's secret shame, the man who descended into its physical hell so that its citizens could maintain the illusion of a civilized life. Once his cart was full, he would begin the final journey of the night, trundling out of the city gates just as the first grey light of dawn broke the horizon, carrying his foul cargo to be dumped in a designated field or a nearby river, leaving the city ready to face another day, its dark, subterranean secret once again hidden, for a time, beneath the ground. While the gong farmer fought a solitary, nocturnal war against the filth produced by the city, another, more public battle was being waged on its surface, in the teeming alleyways, the crowded marketplaces, and the shadowy cellars of every home. This was a relentless war of attrition against a different kind of pest, a creature that thrived in the squalor and darkness, a silent, swarming partner to human civilization, the rat. The soldier in this unending conflict was the rat catcher. We see him in old woodcuts and engravings, a grim, often ragged figure, his face frequently scarred and hardened by his profession, his eyes possessing the sharp, watchful quality of a predator. He was a constant and necessary presence in any medieval town, a living bulwark against a tide of vermin that threatened to consume everything. The medieval city was a paradise for rats. The species in question was primarily the black rat, Rattus rattus, a nimble climber perfectly suited to the timber-framed houses of the era. They found a haven in the thatched roofs, the wattle and daub walls, and the dirt floors of medieval homes. The city offered an endless buffet, refuse heaps in the streets, poorly stored grain in warehouses, scraps from kitchens, and the waste from butcher shops. The rat population exploded, living in a parallel society alongside humans, a shadow kingdom that swarmed in the walls and under the floors. They were a source of constant economic damage, gnawing through sacks of precious flour, fouling food supplies, and destroying property. They were also a source of deep-seated fear and revulsion, seen as creatures of the night, symbols of decay and corruption. The rat catcher's job was to keep this shadow kingdom in check. His tools were often simple and brutal. His primary weapon might be a heavy wooden club or a specially designed iron staff, used for dispatching his quarry with a swift, efficient blow. He would carry a large wire cage, not just for transport, but for public display. At the end of the day, he would present his catch to the town reeve or another official, and he would be paid a bounty, often a penny or a half-penny per rat tail produced as evidence. This system of payment by result ensured he was incentivized to be as effective as possible. He was, in essence, a freelance exterminator, his income directly tied to his daily body count. But the rat catcher's most effective tools were not inanimate objects. They were his living, breathing partners in the hunt. He was often accompanied by a small, wiry terrier, a dog bred specifically for its gameness, its relentless tenacity, and its fearless aggression towards vermin. These dogs were fast, agile, and possessed a powerful bite, capable of snapping a rat's spine in a single shake. The dog could follow the rat catcher into cellars and stable yards, its keen sense of smell locating nests the human eye would miss. The relationship between the catcher and his dog was a deep, symbiotic one, a partnership forged in the grime and darkness of the city's underbelly. Alternatively, or in addition, the rat catcher might carry a ferret, its long, slinking body a perfect tool for flushing rats from their burrows. The ferret, often muzzled to prevent it from simply eating its prey underground, would be sent down a rat hole. Its musky scent and predatory presence would send the rats bolting for the exits, where the rat catcher and his dog would be waiting, ready to pounce. This coordinated, multi-species attack was a highly effective, if gruesome, form of pest control. The rat catcher's life was one of constant, low-level danger. He worked in the filthiest parts of the city, crawling through cramped, dark spaces that were thick with dust, mold, and animal waste. The risk of being bitten was a daily reality. A cornered rat is a ferocious animal, and a rat catcher's hands and arms would have been a latticework of old scars and fresh scratches. In an age without antibiotics or proper antiseptics, any one of these bites could become dangerously infected, leading to fever, sepsis, and even death. He was a man who courted infection as a matter of course. His social status was ambiguous. On the one hand, he performed a vital public service. He was hired by kings and commoners alike to protect their property and their health. Some famous rat catchers even gained a degree of celebrity, their skills lauded in stories and songs. Some embellished their role with a theatrical flair, mixing poisons and potions of their own concoction, claiming secret knowledge passed down through generations. They might wear distinctive costumes adorned with rat tails or skins to advertise their trade. But on the other hand, their work was inherently dirty. They were perpetually associated with vermin and decay, and this association tainted them. They were not revered like a skilled guild craftsman, but viewed as a necessary, if somewhat unsavory, functionary. This all changed with the arrival of the Great Pestilence. When the Black Death swept across Europe in the mid-14th century, the role of the rat catcher was transformed from one of mundane pest control to one of terrifying, frontline importance. Though no one in the medieval world understood the complex transmission vector, the Yersinia pestis bacterium, carried by fleas, which in turn were hosted by rats, they made an intuitive connection between the rats and the plague. They observed that where the rats died, people died soon after, and so in a desperate attempt to fight the pestilence, cities ramped up their efforts to exterminate the rat population. The rat catcher was suddenly one of the most essential figures in a community's desperate struggle for survival. He was offered huge sums of money, a king's ransom in hazard pay, to wage his war on the vermin. He was now a man walking into the very heart of the plague. He was wading into the epicenter of the disease, surrounded by the very creatures that carried the seeds of death. Every nest he disturbed, every dead rat he handled, potentially exposed him to a cloud of infected fleas. He was a frontline soldier in a desperate war, but he was fighting the wrong enemy, using the wrong tactics, completely unaware of the true nature of the invisible foe that was destroying his world. The futility of his task was matched only by its immense danger. The life of a rat catcher during the plague years must have been one of almost unimaginable terror, a daily gamble with a swift and agonizing death. He was a symbol of humanity's desperate, ignorant struggle against a force of nature it could not comprehend, a man paid to fight the shadow while the substance of the disease passed him by, unseen. From the filth of the city, both above and below ground, our journey now takes us out of the urban maze and into the natural world, to the swamps, the fens, the marshes, and the stagnant pools of water that dotted the medieval landscape. These were liminal places, seen as unhealthy and vaguely sinister, breeding grounds for mists, fevers, and strange creatures. And it was here that another strange and thankless profession was practiced, one that required a unique and intimate form of self-sacrifice. This was the world of the leech collector. To understand the leech collector, one must first grasp the absolute dominance of humoral theory in medieval medicine. For over 1,000 years, medical thought, inherited from the ancient Greeks Hippocrates and Galen, was built upon the idea of the four humours: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. A healthy person was one in whom these four fluids were in perfect balance. Sickness, therefore, was almost always diagnosed as an imbalance, a surplus of one humour or another. The logical cure was to remove the excess, and the most common, universal, and dramatic method for doing this was bloodletting. Phlebotomy, as it was formerly known, was a panacea, a cure-all applied to an astonishing range of ailments, from fevers and headaches to melancholy and madness. The physician would diagnose the illness, and the barber surgeon, a lower-class craftsman who combined the skills of haircutting, dentistry, and minor surgery, would perform the procedure. Sometimes, this was done with a lancet, opening a vein directly. But for a more controlled, gentle, and sustained bleeding, the preferred tool was the medicinal leech, Hirudo medicinalis. The demand for leeches was immense and constant. Every monastery infirmary, every town barber surgeon, every court physician needed a steady supply. But leeches could not be farmed or bred in captivity with any success. They had to be gathered, harvested from the wild like any other natural resource. This grim and thankless task fell almost exclusively to the most impoverished and marginalized members of rural society. It was often the work of old women, widows who had no family to support them and no other means of earning a living. The leech collector, or leech gatherer, was a figure of profound pathos, a person driven by poverty to a profession that exploited their own body. The method was as simple as it was gruesome. The collector would set out at dawn for the marshes. Their equipment was minimal: a wooden staff to probe the muddy ground and a tin or earthenware jar, often with a perforated lid, to hold their catch. The key to the harvest was the bait, and the bait was the collector's own body. They would hitch up their worn woolen skirts or trousers and wade slowly into the murky, stagnant water. The water would be icy cold, the bottom a treacherous mix of soft mud, sharp rocks, and tangled reeds. And then they would wait. They would stand motionless for hours, a lonely, still figure in the desolate landscape, enduring the cold, the damp, and the swarm of biting insects. The leeches, attracted by the warmth and scent of a living body, would emerge from the mud and swim towards this unexpected feast. They would attach themselves to the collector's exposed legs and ankles, their three-bladed jaws making a painless, star-shaped incision, their saliva releasing an anticoagulant, pyridine, to ensure the blood flowed freely. When their legs were covered in the squirming, black, blood-sucking creatures, the collector would carefully wade back to shore. The next step was a delicate one. They could not simply rip the leeches off, as this could leave the creature's teeth embedded in the skin, causing a festering wound. Instead, they would coax them off, perhaps with a touch of salt or vinegar, or simply wait for them to become fully engorged and drop off on their own. Each precious leech, now fat and full of the collector's own blood, would be carefully placed in the jar. They were paid by the leech, a pittance for a day of miserable, dangerous work. A full day's gathering might only earn enough to buy a loaf of bread. The life of a leech collector was a litany of misery and peril. The most immediate danger was infection. The stagnant marsh water they waded in was a foul soup of bacteria and parasites. Every leech bite was a tiny open wound, a potential gateway for a fatal infection like tetanus or gangrene. The bites themselves would often become inflamed, itchy, and ulcerated. Furthermore, the constant, daily loss of blood could lead to chronic anemia, leaving the collector weak, pale, and perpetually exhausted. They were literally draining their own life force away to supply the medical trade. They were the living embodiment of the ultimate paradox of medieval medicine. A person who systematically sacrificed their own health, who courted infection and disease on a daily basis, all to provide a cure that was itself a form of controlled therapeutic injury. They were the lowest, most unseen rung of a vast medical economy, their own blood the currency that purchased another person's dubious chance at health. They were the silent, suffering providers for a system that consumed them. From the realm of the physically unclean, a world of waste and vermin and disease, we now move to a place far stranger, to the shadowy borderlands where the worlds of the living and the dead converged. This was a world where the spiritual was as real and tangible as the physical, where the fate of one's immortal soul was the paramount concern of every waking and dying moment. The medieval Christian worldview was starkly defined. After death, a soul faced judgment, with the glorious reward of heaven or the eternal torments of hell hanging in the balance. Sin was not merely a moral concept, but a quantifiable substance, a stain upon the soul that could cling even after death, a heavy weight that could drag one down into perdition. The Church offered a powerful remedy in the form of confession, penance, and last rites. But what of the person who died suddenly, without a priest? What of the sins they had forgotten to confess, the small transgressions that lingered on their conscience? This terror, the fear of a bad death, gave rise, in the most remote and superstitious corners of Britain, particularly in the rugged hills of Wales and the English border counties of Shropshire and Herefordshire, to a folk tradition of breathtaking strangeness, and to a profession that was one of the most bizarre and spiritually fraught imaginable, the sin-eater. Imagine a small, isolated village, nestled in a valley far from the centres of ecclesiastical power. A farmer lies dead in his cottage, his body laid out on a table, prepared for burial. The family is consumed by grief, but also by a gnawing spiritual anxiety. The man had lived a good life, but he was human. He had sworn in anger, perhaps coveted his neighbor's livestock, or told a lie to a trader at market. These were the minor, everyday sins that might have been overlooked in the final, hurried moments of life. The priest was miles away and could not be summoned in time for a final confession. So the family, steeped in ancient folk beliefs that mingled uneasily with Orthodox Christianity, sent for another kind of help. The help that arrived was not a man of God, but a pariah, a gaunt and impoverished figure who lived on the very fringes of society, often in a hovel on the edge of the village commons. This was the sin-eater. He was summoned, not invited. His arrival was met with a mixture of desperate hope and profound revulsion. He would not enter the cottage through the main door, but was often brought in through a side entrance, as if his very presence might contaminate the living. He was led into the room where the corpse lay, a space thick with the scent of herbs and death. The family would avert their eyes, making no conversation with him. Their interaction was purely transactional, a grim and necessary ritual. A living family member, typically the widow or the eldest son, would place a loaf of bread, often a coarse, dark loaf, directly onto the chest of the deceased. Sometimes, alongside the bread, they would place a simple wooden bowl filled with beer or ale. Then they would place a small coin, usually a groat worth fourpence, into the dead man's hand. The sin-eater, in solemn silence, would step forward. He would lean over the body, his face close to the cold, still face of the dead. He would then recite a formulaic incantation, a strange piece of folk poetry that sealed the pact. One recorded version of the incantation goes, "I give easement and rest now to thee, dear man. Come not down the lanes or in our meadows, and for thy peace I pawn my own soul. Amen." With these words he would reach out, take the loaf of bread from the corpse's chest and eat it, every last crumb. He would then pick up the bowl of beer and drink it down. The ritual was now complete. In the logic of this powerful folk magic, the bread and drink, having been in physical contact with the body, had miraculously absorbed all the lingering, unconfessed sins of the dead person. The sin-eater, by consuming the food and drink, had literally ingested those sins. He had taken the spiritual corruption, the moral failings, the entire remainder of the deceased's spiritual debt into his own body. He had become a vessel for the damnation of another. The soul of the departed, now cleansed and unburdened, was free to ascend to heaven. Having performed his terrible service, the sin-eater would then take the coin from the dead man's hand. This was his payment. He would turn and leave as he had come, in silence, without a word of thanks, vanishing back into the shadows from which he had emerged. But the spiritual cost of this transaction was immense and permanent. By taking on the sins of others, the sin-eater became a walking repository of spiritual filth, a man perpetually tainted by the accumulated transgressions of the dead. He was the ultimate scapegoat, but unlike the biblical scapegoat sent into the wilderness, he was not allowed to leave. He was trapped within the community that both needed and despised him. He was utterly ostracized, a figure of profound fear and revulsion. The very communities that relied upon his services in their most desperate hour shunned him in their daily lives. People would avoid his gaze on the village green. They would cross the muddy street to avoid passing him. His shadow falling upon a person was considered a terrible omen. He was forbidden from entering a church, and if he died, he was often denied a Christian burial. His children, if he had any, would inherit his stigma. They were untouchables, living specters in a society obsessed with spiritual purity. Their only human contact was with the dead and the grieving. The sin-eater's existence was one of almost unimaginable loneliness and alienation. A life of ritualized damnation. He was a form of spiritual gong farmer, a man who willingly, for the price of a crust of bread and a few pennies, cleansed the souls of the dead by absorbing their corruption into his own, ensuring that he himself would have no hope of salvation. He was a man damned in this life, so that others might find peace in the next. The practice was, of course, condemned by the church as a blasphemous and superstitious pagan survival, but it persisted in remote areas for centuries, a testament to the enduring power of humanity's fear of what lies beyond the veil of death. While the sin-eater trafficked with the invisible souls of the dead, another shadowy profession dealt directly with their physical remains, their flesh and bones. This was the world of the resurrectionist, a romantic, almost heroic name that cloaks a grimmer, more common title. the grave robber or the body snatcher. Their work was not driven by superstition, but by the dawning and often frustrated light of scientific inquiry. The late medieval period and the Renaissance sparked a profound new interest in the inner workings of the human body. The anatomical drawings of Leonardo da Vinci, the groundbreaking work of Andreas Vesalius at the University of Padua, these were part of a great intellectual quest to understand the hidden architecture of the human form. To do this, pioneering anatomists, physicians, and surgeons needed one crucial resource above all others: human corpses to dissect. But the law and social custom stood firmly in their way. The sanctity of the grave was a deeply held belief. The idea of cutting up a human body, the vessel that would one day be resurrected on Judgment Day, was seen by many as a monstrous act of desecration. The law was therefore incredibly strict. In most parts of Europe, the only bodies legally available for dissection were those of executed criminals, typically murderers who had been condemned to be hanged and anatomized. This very limited supply could never hope to meet the burgeoning demand from the new medical schools and the private anatomy theatres that were springing up in cities like London, Paris, and Edinburgh. A single medical school might need dozens of bodies a year for its students. This enormous gap between supply and demand created the perfect conditions for a lucrative, dangerous, and illegal black market. The resurrectionists were the suppliers of this market. They were the men who procured the goods that the anatomists so desperately needed. They were often a motley and unsavory crew. Some were disgraced medical students, men who had the anatomical knowledge but lacked the scruples to finish their degrees. Others were desperate laborers, gravediggers, or cemetery workers who saw a chance to supplement their meager incomes with a bit of nocturnal enterprise. And many were simply hardened criminals, thugs who were drawn to the promise of easy money and were undeterred by the ghoulish nature of the work. Their work took place under the cloak of the deepest night in the eerie, windswept silence of the churchyard. They were masters of stealth and efficiency. They would travel in small groups or gangs armed with their specialized tools. They rarely used metal spades, as the sound of steel striking a stone or a coffin nail could alert the watch. Instead, they favored specially designed wooden spades, which were quieter. They also carried lanterns shrouded in cloth, crowbars, and coils of thick rope. Their first task was reconnaissance. They needed to identify a fresh grave, as a recently interred body was easier to extract and in better condition for the anatomists. They often had informants inside the system, a corrupt sexton who would tip them off about a burial in exchange for a cut of the profits, or a hospital orderly who would let them know when a pauper had died. Once a target was selected, they would move in with a cold, professional speed. They would not, as is commonly imagined, dig up the entire coffin. That would take too much time and create too much evidence. Their method was far more efficient. They would dig a single, narrow shaft at the head end of the grave, down to the level of the coffin. They would then use their crowbars and hooks to break open the lid of the coffin, a splintering of wood that must have sounded like a gunshot in the dead silence of the night. Ropes would be fastened around the corpse's neck or under its arms. Then, with a series of coordinated heaves, the body would be unceremoniously hauled out of the ground, its limbs stiff with rigor mortis, dragging through the narrow earthen tunnel. Once the body was out, they would work quickly to strip it of its winding sheet and any clothing. This was not done out of respect, but out of legal necessity. In a strange quirk of English law, a human body could not be legally owned, and therefore, stealing one was not technically considered a major felony. It was a misdemeanor, punishable by a fine or a short prison sentence. Stealing the coffin or the shroud that the body was buried in, however, was theft of property, a much more serious crime that could result in transportation or even hanging. The resurrectionists were body snatchers, not property thieves. Once the corpse was naked, it was folded into a large sack or crammed into a hamper and carried off into the night to be delivered to the back door of an anatomy school before dawn. The grave would then be hastily refilled, the turf replaced, so that in the morning the family of the deceased might not even realize that their loved one's final resting place had been violated. This was a life of constant, multi-layered peril. The physical work was demanding and unpleasant. The risk of contracting diseases from handling fresh corpses was always present. But the greatest threat by far came from the living. Public outrage against the body snatchers was intense. The fear of being dissected, of having one's body mutilated after death, was a primal terror for many people. Families went to extraordinary lengths to protect the graves of their recently deceased loved ones. They would hire armed watchmen to patrol the churchyards at night. They would place massive, heavy stone slabs known as mort safes over the coffin. They would even build locked iron cages or mort houses around the grave itself. The resurrectionists, therefore, were hunted men. They often had to fight their way past these watchmen, engaging in brutal nighttime brawls among the tombstones. If caught by a mob, they faced summary justice, which could mean a savage beating or even being lynched on the spot. They were ghouls in the service of science, men who performed a gruesome but necessary function in the advancement of medical knowledge, profaning the sanctity of the grave so that the hidden secrets of the human body could be laid bare on the cold stone of the dissection table. Their work existed in a dark, moral, grey zone, an unholy alliance between the criminal underworld and the intellectual elite, a partnership that pushed the boundaries of both law and ethics in the relentless pursuit of knowledge. From the quiet profanity of the graveyard, we return with a sickening lurch to the terror of the city street during its darkest and most desperate hours, the time of the Great Pestilence. When the Black Death and the successive waves of plague that followed it for the next 300 years swept through the towns and cities of Europe, it was a cataclysm that beggars modern description. It was not just a medical crisis, it was a complete societal breakdown, a plunge into a world of apocalyptic horror that shattered the very foundations of human community. The sheer, overwhelming volume of the dead was a logistical nightmare that collapsed every normal ritual of life and death. In this environment of mass death and existential terror, a new, temporary, and perhaps most terrifying job of the era was created out of sheer, grim necessity. This was the role of the plague corpse collector. These men, often known simply as bearers or buriers, were not undertakers in any recognizable sense. They were something far more elemental. They were the human machinery of disposal in a world that was producing corpses faster than it could bury them. The job was one that no person would take unless driven by one of two powerful motivators: utter, abject desperation or the promise of an enormous financial reward. When the plague struck a city, the normal social order dissolved. The rich fled to their country estates. The city officials and the clergy were often among the first to perish or flee. The city was left to fend for itself, and the primary, overwhelming problem was the bodies. A body left to rot in a house was a source of unimaginable stench and, it was correctly believed, a nexus of further infection. The dead had to be removed. And so, the remaining municipal authorities would offer staggering sums of money, a lifetime's wages for a few weeks of work, to any man brave or foolish enough to take on the role of a corpse collector. They moved through the skeletal city like figures from a nightmare, their approach often heralded by the slow, rhythmic ringing of a handbell. Their cry, a mournful, chanted phrase, would echo through the deserted, silent streets. "Bring out your dead!" It was a sound that struck a unique blend of terror and relief in the hearts of the survivors who were barricaded inside their homes, often trapped in a single room with the decomposing bodies of their own families. Upon hearing the cry, a door would creak open and the living would perform the final, agonizing act of parting. They would drag the bodies of their loved ones, their parents, their spouses, their children, out of the house and leave them in the gutter. There was no ceremony, no prayer, no dignity. It was a raw, brutal act of sanitary necessity. The collectors themselves were a grim spectacle. In the earlier plagues, they often had little to no protective clothing, perhaps only a simple cloth held over their nose and mouth, a futile gesture against a disease they did not understand. In later outbreaks, particularly in the 17th century, the iconic and terrifying figure of the plague doctor emerged, with his beaked mask filled with aromatic herbs. But the common corpse collector was rarely so well equipped. They were armed with simple, functional tools, long-handled hooks or pikes, and heavy-duty carts, often called dead carts. The hooks were essential. They allowed the collectors to snag the bodies from a distance, avoiding as much direct physical contact as possible, and to drag the corpses, rigid with rigor mortis or horribly limp in the summer heat, onto the cart. The work was a relentless, minute-by-minute confrontation with abject horror. The sensory assault is difficult to comprehend. The sights were those of death in its most grotesque forms. Bodies discolored by the telltale buboes and subcutaneous bleeding that gave the Black Death its name. Faces frozen in agony, bodies swollen with the gases of decomposition. The stench was a thick, sweet, cloying miasma of death that permeated everything. The collectors piled the bodies high on their carts, a macabre jumble of limbs and faces, men, women, and children all thrown together in a final, anonymous indignity. They were no longer people. They were refuse to be cleared. Once the cart was full, their journey would take them to the edge of the city. Here, the traditional churchyards had long since been overwhelmed. There was no space for individual graves, no time for individual funerals. Instead, great plague pits had been dug by teams of labourers. These were vast, yawning trenches, gaping wounds in the earth. The collectors would back their carts up to the edge of the pit and simply tilt the contents in. The bodies would tumble down, a cascade of human forms, landing in a chaotic heap at the bottom. Layers of quicklime would be shoveled in on top of the bodies to hasten decomposition and control the smell, and then a thin layer of earth before the next cart arrived to deposit its grim cargo. The chronicler Agnolo di Tura of Siena, who buried his own 5 children with his own hands, described the scene in 1348. In many places in Siena, great pits were dug and piled deep with the multitude of dead, and they died by the hundreds both day and night. And as soon as those ditches were filled, more were dug, and I buried my 5 children with my own hands. And so many died that all believed that it was the end of the world. The life of a plague corpse collector was a life lived in the absolute epicenter of death. They were surrounded by the disease, breathed it in, touched it, lived in it. Unsurprisingly, their own lives were often brutally and predictably short. They were spectral figures, often ostracized by the few remaining healthy citizens who saw them as harbingers of doom, men tainted by the very contagion they were trying to contain. They were often drunk, numbing their senses with cheap ale to endure the horrors of their daily work. Yet, in their own grim way, they were heroes. They were the men who, for a handful of silver and the promise of a quick death, performed a final, necessary, and profoundly humane service in a world that had descended into an inhuman hell. They maintained the last vestiges of civic order, preventing the city from literally choking on its own dead. And in doing so, they allowed the possibility of an eventual recovery. From the mass, anonymous death of the plague pit, we move to the highly ritualized, public, and personal death of the executioner's block. Here, in the heart of the city square, another set of strange and gruesome jobs existed. Jobs dedicated to the state's ultimate expression of power: judicial killing. The executioner himself was a figure of immense public fascination and fear, a skilled craftsman whose trade was the artful destruction of the human body. But he did not work alone. He required a team, and the most junior member of this team, the apprentice in the Guild of Death, held the title of executioner's assistant. This role was the entry-level position in the grim hierarchy of state-sanctioned violence. The assistant, often a young man, sometimes even the executioner's own son, performed the menial, inglorious, and stomach-churning tasks that were essential for the smooth operation of a public execution. His work began before the main event. He was responsible for the maintenance of the tools of the trade. It was his job to sharpen the axes and swords, to check the ropes for the gallows, to ensure the mechanisms of the breaking wheel or the rack were in working order. He was a stagehand for a theatre of cruelty, ensuring that every prop was ready for the performance. On the day of the execution, the assistant's role was varied and vital. He would help escort the condemned prisoner from the jail to the scaffold, walking alongside the cart, clearing the way through the jeering, excited crowd. Once on the scaffold, in the full view of thousands of spectators, his duties became more intimate. If the punishment was beheading, one of his most important tasks was to prepare the victim. This might involve cutting the prisoner's hair away from their neck to allow the executioner a clear strike. In some cases, for particularly terrified or resistant prisoners, the assistant had the terrifying job of holding them down, forcing their head onto the block, his own hands and arms just inches away from the descending blade. His calm, steady presence was crucial to prevent a last-minute struggle that could lead to a botched execution, a horror for the crowd and a mark of shame on the executioner's professional reputation. If the punishment was hanging, he would assist in placing the noose around the prisoner's neck and would be one of the men to pull away the ladder or release the trap door. For punishments involving torture, such as drawing and quartering, the assistant's role was even more gruesome. He would be the one to hand the executioner the red-hot pincers, the branding irons, or the knives used for disemboweling. He was the ever-present, silent partner in the infliction of unimaginable pain. But his work did not end when the prisoner's life was extinguished. He was also the cleaner. After a beheading, the scaffold would be slick with blood. It was the assistant's job to clean it, to swab the boards with buckets of water, to gather up the bloody sawdust that had been scattered to absorb the gore. This was not just a matter of hygiene, it was about preparing the stage for the next act, should there be multiple executions on the same day. His most iconic and symbolic task, however, was the handling of the head. After a beheading for treason, the head of the condemned was not buried with the body. It was a trophy, a warning to all would-be traitors. It was the assistant who would pick up the freshly severed head by its hair, hold it aloft for the crowd to see, and then take it to be prepared for public display. This involved parboiling the head to slow its decay and then impaling it on a long iron spike to be mounted above the city gates or on London Bridge. He was the man who transformed a piece of human anatomy into a powerful symbol of state terror. The life of an executioner's assistant, like that of his master, was one of profound social paradox. He was a state employee, performing a legally mandated and necessary function of the justice system. Yet he was also deeply and irrevocably tainted by his proximity to death and violence. He was shunned, considered to be in a state of perpetual ritual impurity. He was often subject to the same social restrictions as the executioner, forced to live in a specific part of town, sometimes in a house attached to the jail or the gallows itself. He could not hold any other trade, and his family was similarly ostracized. Yet, the job offered a path to a strange form of prosperity and status. If he proved himself capable, if he had a strong stomach and a steady hand, he could one day inherit his master's position, becoming the high executioner himself, a man feared and reviled, but also a man of considerable power and wealth within his own dark corner of the medieval world. He was an apprentice in the most brutal of all crafts, learning the grim trade of ending human life at the behest of the law. From the public spectacle of the scaffold, a theatre of calculated and state-sanctioned pain, we now turn to a form of labour that was equally punishing but almost entirely unseen. It was a job born not of justice but of pure mechanical necessity, a role that reduced a human being to little more than a living cog in a machine. This was the grueling, thankless, and mind-numbingly repetitive world of the treadwheel labourer. These individuals were, in the most literal sense, the engine of medieval heavy industry, the human hamsters whose relentless, plodding steps powered the great cranes and mills that built the cathedrals and fed the cities. The treadwheel, or magna rota, great wheel, was a remarkable piece of medieval engineering, a simple yet ingenious solution to the problem of lifting immense weight. Imagine the construction site of a great Gothic cathedral, a project that could take centuries to complete. Towering stone walls rise towards the heavens, and massive blocks of limestone, heavy oak beams, and sheets of lead for the roof need to be lifted hundreds of feet into the air. The block and tackle, powered by a simple winch, was insufficient for these monumental tasks. The solution was to build a crane powered by a massive wooden wheel, sometimes up to 15 feet or more in diameter, wide enough for 1 or 2 men to walk inside. This was the treadwheel. By walking forward, the labourer's body weight would turn the great wheel, which in turn would wind a rope or chain around a central axle, slowly and inexorably hoisting the heavy cargo. The men who performed this labour were at the very bottom of the construction hierarchy. They were not skilled masons or carpenters who would leave their mark on the finished cathedral for generations to see. They were unskilled, anonymous labourers, their contribution as invisible as it was essential. Their work was a form of penal servitude, often performed by prisoners of war, debtors working off their obligations, or simply the most desperate day labourers who had no other options. To be a treadwheel laborer was to be a beast of burden, valued not for your mind or your skill, but purely for your weight and your stamina. The daily reality of this job was a monotonous, soul-crushing ordeal. The laborer would begin his day by climbing into the great, dark, drum-like structure. The wheel would be tilted at a slight angle. As he began to walk, his world would shrink to the few wooden planks directly in front of his feet. He would walk and walk and walk, for hours on end, his gaze fixed on the endlessly repeating cycle of the wheel's interior. It was a Sisyphean task, a journey without a destination. The only sound would be the rhythmic thud of his own feet, the creak and groan of the massive wooden axle, and the shouted commands of the master mason from far below. The work required not just physical endurance, but a profound mental fortitude to withstand the hypnotic, mind-numbing repetition. The dangers were constant and severe. A moment of inattention, a trip on a loose plank, or a sudden dizzy spell could be catastrophic. If a man fell inside the turning wheel, he could be horribly crushed or have his limbs broken as he was tumbled around like a stone in a giant's drum. The risk of falling out of the wheel, which was often positioned precariously high up on the scaffolding of the rising cathedral walls, meant a certain and terrifying death on the stones below. There was also the ever-present danger of the load itself. If the rope or chain hoisting the multi-ton block of stone were to snap, the sudden release of tension would cause the wheel to spin backwards at an uncontrollable, terrifying speed. The men inside would be thrown about violently, their bodies broken by the sheer velocity and force of the machine they had been powering. This same technology was also applied to other industries, most notably in milling. While most mills were powered by wind or water in areas where these were not available, or for specific tasks, a treadwheel mill might be constructed. Here, the endless walking of the laborers would turn the massive millstones that ground grain into flour. This was perhaps an even more hellish existence than working on a construction crane. The work was indoors, often in a cramped, dark, and poorly ventilated space. The air would be thick with fine flour dust, a substance that coated the lungs and led to a host of chronic respiratory diseases, a condition known as baker's lung. The laborer would spend his entire day walking in place, choking on dust, his only reward a meager wage and the promise of a shortened life. They were the forgotten engines of the medieval economy, their muscular energy transmuted into the stones of a cathedral or the flour for a loaf of bread, their own lives consumed in the process. From the anonymous suffering of the treadwheel, we move to a world of gilded cages and vicarious punishment, to one of the most psychologically bizarre and intimate jobs in all of history. This was the role of the whipping boy. This position, which seems like something out of a twisted fairy tale, was a very real and serious institution in the royal courts of Europe, particularly during the 15th and 16th centuries. It was born from a peculiar collision of educational theory and the political doctrine of the divine right of kings. The problem was a simple one. How do you discipline a prince? A young prince, the heir to the throne, was not just a child. He was the future sovereign, a person whose body was considered sacred and inviolable, a representative of God's will on earth. His tutor, no matter how learned or high-ranking, could not simply take a cane and thrash the royal heir for failing to learn his Latin declensions or for behaving badly. To strike the prince would be an act of lèse-majesté, an offense against the crown itself. Yet the prince needed to be corrected. He needed to learn that his actions had consequences. The solution was ingenious and cruel. A boy of noble birth, often from a family of high standing at court, would be selected to be the prince's official companion. He would be raised alongside the prince from a very young age, sharing his tutors, his meals, his games, and his chambers. The two boys were encouraged to become the closest of friends, to form a deep and genuine emotional bond. This friendship was the very mechanism of the punishment. For this companion was the whipping boy. Whenever the young prince committed an offense, be it a lapse in his studies, an act of disobedience, or a fit of petulance, it was the whipping boy who would be taken away and ceremonially and often brutally flogged in his place. The logic was purely psychological. The prince, unable to be punished himself, would be forced to watch or listen to his dearest friend crying out in pain, a pain that he himself had caused. The guilt, the shame, and the empathy he felt for his friend's suffering were intended to be a more powerful and effective deterrent than any physical pain he could have endured himself. The whipping boy's tears were the prince's lesson. It was a system that relied on a sophisticated, if cruel, understanding of emotional transference. The life of a whipping boy was a surreal paradox. On the one hand, he lived a life of immense privilege. He was a resident of the royal palace, dressed in fine clothes, fed the richest food, and given the best education in the kingdom. He was the most intimate confidant of the future king, a position of unparalleled access and potential future influence. The friendship was often very real. The boys would develop a deep and lasting bond, a brotherhood forged in the unique crucible of their shared royal childhood. But on the other hand, the whipping boy's existence was predicated on pain and injustice. He lived with the constant threat of a beating for a crime he did not commit. He had to endure physical punishment without complaint, understanding that his suffering was symbolic, a service to the crown. He could not fight back, could not resent the prince, for their friendship was the entire point of the exercise. The historical record provides us with several famous examples. William Murray, later the first Earl of Dysart, served as the whipping boy for the young Charles V of England. The two remained exceptionally close friends for their entire lives, a bond of affection that was clearly not broken by the institutionalized cruelty of their childhood. Similarly, Barnaby Fitzpatrick, a young Irish nobleman, was the whipping boy for Prince Edward, the son of Henry VIII, who would become King Edward VI. Their surviving letters from later in life show a deep and abiding friendship, filled with personal jokes and genuine warmth. These relationships suggest that while the practice was undeniably bizarre and unjust from a modern perspective, it may not have been perceived as purely traumatic by the participants themselves. The role of whipping boy was seen as a position of honor, a service to the royal family that could bring immense rewards in the future. The boy who took the beatings for the prince could, as a man, expect to be granted titles, lands, and a powerful position at court when his royal friend finally ascended the throne. His childhood pain was a long-term investment in a lifetime of favor and influence. He was a living symbol of the strange contortions of logic required to navigate a world where a child's body could be simultaneously sacred and subject to the most intimate forms of correction. From the psychological intricacies of the royal court, we plunge back into the muck and mire of common life, to the world of folk medicine and village healers, where desperation and superstition mingled to create remedies of startling strangeness. In an age before germ theory, when the true causes of disease were a profound mystery, sickness was often attributed to malevolent spirits, imbalances in the humors, or mysterious poisons rising from the earth. The cures were often as strange as the perceived causes, and the practitioners were a motley collection of village wise women, traveling charlatans, and sincere but misguided folk healers. Among the most bizarre of these was the practitioner of a very specific and deeply unsettling form of cure, the toad doctor. This was not a formal profession in the sense of a guild-certified physician, but rather a specialized role within the sprawling, unregulated world of folk medicine. The toad doctor was a healer whose primary, and often only, tool was the common toad. To the medieval mind, the toad was a creature of profound symbolic power and ambiguity. It was an amphibian, born of the water but living on the land, a creature of the earth's damp, dark places. It was seen as ugly, venomous, and intrinsically linked to witchcraft and the demonic. Its warty skin, its association with poison, and its cold-blooded nature made it a living embodiment of corruption and disease. And it was precisely for this reason that it was believed to hold immense curative power. The principle at work was a form of sympathetic magic, the idea that like cures like, or more accurately, that a creature embodying sickness could be used to draw that sickness out of a human body. The toad doctor's services would be sought for a variety of ailments, but particularly for skin conditions like scrofula, a form of tuberculosis that caused swollen neck glands, tumors, boils, and even the buboes of the plague. The methods were varied, but all shared a core of visceral, hands-on application. One common practice was to take a live toad, kill it, and hang it in a small silk or linen bag around the neck of the patient. It was believed that as the toad's corpse slowly dried out and withered away, the patient's tumor or swelling would likewise shrink and disappear, the toad's body having magically absorbed the affliction. A more direct and more gruesome method involved applying a live toad directly to the afflicted area. A person suffering from a painful boil or a plague bubo might have a live toad held against the swelling. It was believed that the toad, being a creature of poison, would be drawn to the venom of the disease and would actively suck it out. Some accounts describe the toad swelling up as it supposedly drew out the sickness, sometimes to the point of bursting, a sign that the cure was working. The toad doctor would then apply a fresh toad and another until the patient was either deemed cured or had died from their illness. The most extreme version of this therapy was reserved for diseases like smallpox. The patient would be instructed to hold a live toad in their mouth, or a dried and powdered toad would be administered as a medicine, the idea being that the creature's essence would combat the disease from within. The men and women who practiced this strange medicine were not trained physicians. They were village healers whose knowledge was a passed-down mixture of herbalism, magical incantations, and bizarre animal-based remedies. They were often viewed with a mixture of fear and respect. Their ability to handle the unclean toad gave them a shaman-like status, positioning them as individuals who could traffic with the darker forces of nature to produce a positive outcome. They were doctors of the earth, their pharmacy, the swamp, and the ditch, their methods a stark reminder of a world desperately trying to make sense of suffering, using the most powerful symbols it had at its disposal. The toad, a creature of pestilence, was transformed into a vessel of healing, a living poultice that promised to absorb the pain of the world, one afflicted body at a time. Finally, we come to the executioner, the man whose profession stood at the nexus of law, religion, and public spectacle. We have met his assistant, but the master himself occupied one of the most profoundly paradoxical roles in the entire medieval social order. He was a state official, a salaried employee of the city or the crown, tasked with carrying out the final, irreversible judgment of the law. His work was not just a job, it was a public duty, a necessary function for maintaining social order and demonstrating the terrible power of the sovereign. Yet, despite his official status, he was almost universally reviled, a figure of deep social and spiritual contamination. To be an executioner was to be a member of a tainted trade, a dishonorable profession. This dishonor was a complex mixture of legal and religious stigma. He was a man who shed human blood for a living. Even though this shedding was legally sanctioned, it marked him. In the eyes of the church, he was in a state of perpetual impurity. He was often forbidden from receiving communion, and his presence inside a church was considered a profanation. Legally, his testimony was often given less weight in court, and in many places, he and his family were subject to specific sumptuary laws, dictating where they could live and what they could wear. He was typically forced to live in a designated house, often situated near the gallows or the prison, physically segregated from the rest of the community. His wife and children shared his stigma, making marriage outside of other dishonorable families, such as those of knackers or skinners, almost impossible. His profession was often hereditary, a dark inheritance passed from father to son, because few other paths were open to his children. The public's relationship with the executioner was a bizarre cocktail of fascination, dependence, and disgust. On execution day, he was the center of attention, the star of a gruesome public theater. The crowd that gathered in the town square, men, women, and children, watched his every move with rapt attention. A skilled executioner who could perform his task with a single clean blow of the sword or axe was a figure of grudging professional respect. A botched execution, where multiple strikes were needed, would earn him the crowd's fury, who might riot and pelt him with stones. He was both a celebrity and a monster. His job description, however, often went far beyond the simple act of killing. The executioner was the state's master of pain. He was responsible for carrying out judicial torture, using his intimate knowledge of the human body's breaking points to extract confessions from accused heretics or criminals. He operated the rack, the thumbscrews, and the branding irons in the dungeons beneath the courthouse. His role was multifaceted. Because of the widespread belief in sympathetic magic, it was thought that a man so intimately connected with death and the human body must possess unique curative powers. The executioner, therefore, often moonlighted as a folk healer. People would secretly come to him to buy strange remedies, a salve made from human fat, a cure for epilepsy using the blood of a freshly decapitated man, or a talisman made from a piece of the hangman's rope, which was believed to bring good luck. He was both the ultimate taker of life and, in a strange, superstitious way, a giver of health. He was also, in many places, the local animal control officer and the man responsible for clearing the carcasses of dead livestock, further cementing his association with death and filth. The executioner's life was a lonely one, defined by a profound and inescapable paradox. He was a pillar of the legal system, yet a social outcast. He was a public figure, yet a man no one would willingly touch. He was a skilled craftsman whose product was death, a healer whose remedies were born of the scaffold. He was the dark mirror of the king, the man who wielded the power of life and death not through divine right, but through the cold, hard steel of his axe and the practiced knot of his rope. He was the ultimate embodiment of the state's authority, a living symbol of the grim necessities required to hold the violent, vibrant, and deeply strange world of the Middle Ages together. From the anonymous suffering of the treadwheel, a world where men were reduced to mere muscle and sinew, we move to a place of profound and gilded contradiction, the royal court. Here, in the heart of the kingdom, amidst the rustle of silk and the whispered intrigues of power, we find one of the most psychologically bizarre and intimate jobs in all of history. This was the role of the whipping boy. This position, which sounds like a cruel invention from a Grimm's fairy tale, was a very real and serious institution in the courts of Tudor and Stuart England, and in other European monarchies during the 15th, 16th, and 17th centuries. It was not a product of simple sadism, but a strange and intricate solution to a profound political and theological problem. A problem born from the collision of educational necessity and the sacred, untouchable nature of the royal person. To comprehend the existence of the whipping boy, we must first understand the immense, almost mystical power vested in the body of a young prince. In the age of absolute monarchy, the king was not merely a head of state, he was God's chosen representative on earth. This doctrine, the divine right of kings, imbued the monarch's very person with a sacred quality. The king possessed what legal theorists called the king's two bodies. He had a body natural, the mortal, flesh and blood man who could get sick, feel pain, and die. But he also possessed a body politic, an immortal, infallible, and incorporeal body that represented the sovereignty and perpetuity of the state itself. The young prince, as heir to the throne, was the vessel in which this future body politic resided. His physical person was therefore more than just a child's body. It was a sacred vessel, a living symbol of the nation's future and God's divine plan. This created an impossible dilemma for his tutors. A young prince, for all his sacred potential, was still a child. He was prone to laziness, to fits of temper, to arrogance, and to all the mischief and folly of youth. He had to be educated, not just in letters and numbers, but in morals and discipline. In an age where physical chastisement was the cornerstone of all pedagogy, the common refrain being, "Spare the rod and spoil the child." How could one possibly correct the heir to the throne? A tutor, no matter how learned or noble, could not simply take a birch rod and thrash the future king. To strike the prince's sacred body would be an act of profound disrespect, an assault not just on a child, but on the very concept of monarchy. It would be a form of lèse-majesté, a micro-treason that could have severe repercussions. The political risk was immense. How could a subject, even in the name of education, raise a hand against the body that would one day hold absolute power over him? The memory of such a humiliation could fester, and a prince's resentment could prove deadly once he became king. Yet the alternative, allowing a prince to grow up without discipline, was equally terrifying. The history books were filled with cautionary tales of undisciplined, tyrannical rulers who had brought ruin to their kingdoms. A spoiled, arrogant prince could become a monster on the throne, his unchecked whims plunging the nation into war or bankruptcy. The prince had to learn that his actions had consequences. He needed to feel the sting of correction, to understand the sting of justice. The problem seemed intractable: how to punish a body that was, by its very nature, unpunishable. The solution was as ingenious as it was cruel. It was a masterpiece of psychological transference, a piece of living political theatre designed to bypass the prince's sacred flesh and strike directly at his conscience. The court would select another boy, always of noble birth, to be the prince's official companion. This was a position of immense honor for the boy's family, a sign of supreme royal favor. This companion would be raised alongside the prince from the earliest possible age. He was not a servant, but a peer. He shared the prince's chambers, his meals, his tutors, and his games. He learned the same lessons in Latin and Greek, practiced fencing and dancing in the same halls, and knelt beside the prince in the royal chapel. The two boys were systematically encouraged to form the deepest and most genuine bond of friendship. They were to become as brothers, sharing secrets, jokes, and the strange, isolated experience of a royal childhood. This deep, emotional intimacy was not an accidental byproduct of the arrangement. It was the very engine of the punishment, for this companion was the whipping boy. The mechanism was simple. Whenever the young prince committed an offense, if he refused to translate his Ovid, if he showed insolence to a courtier, if he lost his temper during a game of tennis, a formal judgment would be made by his tutor or governor. A punishment was required. But instead of the prince being taken to task, it was his beloved friend, the whipping boy, who would be led away to be punished in his stead. The flogging was a formal, ceremonial affair. It would take place in a private chamber, away from the general view of the court, but with the full weight of official sanction. The whipping boy would be stripped to the waist, perhaps bent over a stool, and the tutor would administer the punishment with a birch rod or a cane. It was a real and painful beating, designed to produce tears and cries of pain. The prince's role in this drama was to be the audience. He was often forced to watch the punishment he had caused, to see the welts rise on his friend's back, to hear his cries for mercy. If he was not made to watch, he would certainly be within earshot, the sounds of the flogging echoing through the stone corridors of the palace. The entire exercise was a calculated assault on the prince's empathy. The physical pain was transferred to the whipping boy, but the psychological pain, the guilt, the shame, the horror of seeing a loved one suffer because of one's own misdeeds, was directed squarely at the prince. This vicarious punishment was believed to be a far more powerful and lasting corrective than any physical pain the prince could have endured himself. It was a lesson in consequence, delivered not to the skin, but to the soul. It was intended to cultivate a sense of justice and responsibility in the future king, to teach him that his actions had real, painful effects on those around him, especially those he cared for. The life of the whipping boy himself was a surreal and complex paradox, a life lived in a state of constant contradiction. On the one hand, he experienced a level of privilege that was almost unimaginable for anyone outside the immediate royal family. He resided in the heart of the palace, a world of staggering luxury and political power. He wore clothes of velvet and silk, ate from the same kitchens that served the king, and was taught by the most brilliant scholars in the kingdom. This education was a prize in itself, providing him with the linguistic skills, the political knowledge, and the courtly graces that would make him an influential figure in his own right. His most valuable asset, however, was his proximity to power. He was the most intimate friend and confidant of the future monarch. He knew the prince's thoughts, his fears, his ambitions. This was a position of unparalleled access, a foundation upon which a lifetime of influence and power could be built. On the other hand, this gilded existence was built upon a foundation of institutionalized injustice and the constant threat of physical pain. The whipping boy lived with the knowledge that he could be beaten at any moment for a crime he did not commit. He had to learn to accept this strange arrangement as a part of his duty. He could not, or was not supposed to, harbor resentment towards the prince, as this would undermine the entire psychological mechanism. Their friendship had to be strong enough to withstand the strain of these vicarious punishments. The aftermath of a flogging must have been a strange and delicate affair. One can imagine the young prince, his eyes red with tears of guilt, seeking out his friend to apologize, to tend to his wounds, to reaffirm their bond. This cycle of transgression, vicarious punishment, and reconciliation may have, paradoxically, forged an even stronger and more resilient friendship between the two boys. A brotherhood founded on a unique and shared trauma. The historical record, though sparse, provides us with several compelling examples that illuminate the reality of this strange position. Perhaps the most well-documented case is that of Barnaby Fitzpatrick, the whipping boy for Prince Edward, the son of King Henry VIII, who would become King Edward VI of England. Barnaby was the son of an Irish peer and was sent to the English court as a boy. He and the young Edward, who were of a similar age, became exceptionally close. They shared a rigorous Protestant and humanist education under tutors like John Check. The affection between them is palpable in their surviving correspondence from later in life. After Edward became king, he sent his beloved friend Barnaby to the French court to complete his education and act as an unofficial observer. Their letters are filled with a mixture of state business and personal news. Edward gently chides Barnaby for his gambling and his fashionable French clothes, while Barnaby reports back on the intrigues of the French court. There is a clear sense of a deep, enduring bond between the two men. For his service and friendship, Barnaby Fitzpatrick was richly rewarded. He was made Baron Upper Ossory in Ireland and became a significant figure in the Tudor administration of his homeland. His childhood endurance of pain had paid off handsomely. An even more famous, if slightly less documented example is that of William Murray, who served as the whipping boy for the young Prince Charles, the future King Charles I of England. Charles, as a boy, was physically frail, shy, and afflicted with a stammer. He formed an intensely close bond with the more robust and confident Murray. Their friendship became the bedrock of Charles's emotional life and would endure through the catastrophic upheavals of the English Civil War. Murray was more than just a childhood friend. He became one of Charles's most trusted advisors and political agents. He was appointed Groom of the Bedchamber, a position of immense intimacy and influence, and was entrusted with the king's most secret negotiations. Even after Charles was imprisoned by the parliamentarian forces, Murray worked tirelessly on his behalf. For his unwavering loyalty, a loyalty forged in the schoolroom and tested on the battlefield, Charles created for him the title of First Earl of Dysart. The story of Charles and William Murray is a powerful testament to the idea that the whipping boy was not seen as a victim, but as a companion whose loyalty was tested and proven through a shared, if unequal, experience of discipline, and who was rewarded with a lifetime of trust and favor. It is important to note that some historians have questioned how formal and widespread the office of whipping boy truly was, suggesting it may have been a more informal practice that was later romanticized and exaggerated. The term itself does not appear in official court records with the same frequency as, say, groom of the stool. However, the evidence from personal letters and contemporary accounts strongly suggests that the practice, whether officially titled or not, certainly existed. It was a logical, if bizarre, extension of the prevailing theories of kingship and education. The practice represents a unique moment in history when political theology had a direct and painful impact on the bodies of children in the schoolroom. The decline of the whipping boy as an institution was a gradual process tied to the erosion of the very ideas that had created it. The Enlightenment of the 18th century brought with it new ideas about education, championed by thinkers like John Locke, who argued for reason and gentle guidance over rote learning and physical punishment. Simultaneously, the political landscape of Europe was changing. The mystical doctrine of the divine right of kings began to give way to more rational, constitutional models of monarchy. The king's body slowly lost its sacred, untouchable quality, and the idea of punishing a prince for his own misdeeds no longer seemed so politically or theologically fraught. The notion of punishing one person for the crimes of another began to seem not ingenious but barbaric and unjust. The whipping boy, a creature of a very specific set of political and pedagogical beliefs, became an anachronism. From the psychological intricacies of the royal court and the grim utility of the executioner's scaffold, we now journey to a different nexus of power, a place far from the centers of governance, yet holding its own profound sway over the lives and fears of ordinary people. We travel to the edge of the village, to the verge of the wild fen, to a low-eaved cottage where smoke curls from a thatched roof and strange herbs hang drying in the rafters. Here, in the world of folk medicine and village cunning, we find a practitioner whose methods challenge our every notion of healing, a figure who wielded one of nature's most reviled creatures as their primary tool. This was the world of the toad doctor. This was not a formal, guild-certified profession. One did not apprentice for 7 years to become a toad doctor, nor receive a charter from a king. It was a role that emerged organically from the deep, damp soil of folk tradition, a specialization within the sprawling, unregulated, and often clandestine world of the cunning folk or village wisewoman. The toad doctor was a healer whose pharmacopoeia was singular, whose cures were viscerally unsettling, and whose power was derived from a deep, ancient, and fearful understanding of the natural world. To comprehend their work, we must first step away from the clean, sterile logic of modern medicine and immerse ourselves in the medieval mindset, a world where the symbolic was as real as the physical, and where the cure for a sickness was often sought in the very heart of the thing that most resembled the disease itself. The foundation of the toad doctor's art lay in the profound and deeply ambivalent status of the toad in the medieval imagination. This was not the charming, comical creature of modern children's stories. The medieval toad, distinct from its smoother-skinned cousin the frog, was a being of deep horror and occult significance. It was first and foremost a creature of the earth's dark, damp, and liminal spaces. It was born of the swamp, the ditch, the stagnant pool, places associated with decay, disease, and the miasmas, or bad airs, that were believed to cause pestilence. It was cold-blooded, its skin warty and glandular, its gaze unblinking and ancient. It was a chthonic entity, a being that seemed to bubble up from the underworld, embodying the corrupt and venomous aspects of nature. This association with poison was not merely symbolic. People knew that toads possessed a potent defense. The prominent parotoid glands behind a toad's eyes secrete a milky white substance, a complex cocktail of toxins, including bufotoxin. While not typically lethal to a human who simply handled the creature, it could cause skin irritation, and if ingested by a dog or other predator, it could be fatal. This real, observable toxicity fueled the toad's sinister reputation. It was seen as a living vessel of venom. This reputation was cemented in the folklore, art, and theology of the age. In Christian iconography, the toad was a common symbol for sin, for heresy, and for the devil himself. It appears in the margins of illuminated manuscripts, a grotesque demon lurking at the edges of sacred text. It was a frequent companion or familiar to the witches described in treatises like the Malleus Maleficarum, a demonic agent sent to curdle milk, blight crops, or poison wells. To find a toad on one's doorstep was a terrible omen. It was a creature that seemed to exude a malevolent, supernatural energy. And yet it was precisely this profound negativity, this deep association with poison, corruption, and disease that made the toad a creature of immense potential power in the world of folk medicine. The logic at play was a primal and powerful form of sympathetic magic. The core belief was that like attracts like, or, in a curative context, that a substance embodying a particular ailment could be used to draw that same ailment out of a suffering human body. If a disease was seen as a form of internal poison, a venom corrupting the flesh, then what better tool to fight it than a creature that was the very essence of poison? The toad became a living poultice, a magical magnet for sickness. The toad doctor was the practitioner who understood this dark sympathy, who had the secret knowledge, the arcanum, to harness the toad's malevolent power and turn it towards a benevolent, healing purpose. The practitioner herself, for it was more often a woman, was a figure as ambivalent as the creature she employed. She was the village cunning woman, the wise woman, a person who lived on the social and geographical margins of the community. Her cottage was often set apart, on the edge of the woods or near the marsh, a physical separation that mirrored her social isolation. Her knowledge was not derived from the Latin texts of Galen and Hippocrates that were studied in the universities. It was an ancestral knowledge, passed down orally from mother to daughter, a complex tapestry woven from herbal lore, ancient pagan beliefs, Christian prayers, and a deep, intuitive observation of the natural world. She was the community's repository of forbidden and alternative wisdom. Her relationship with the village was one of profound tension. She was feared for her association with the uncanny, her strange remedies, and her communion with the wilder aspects of nature. Her neighbors might whisper that she was a witch, that she could curdle the milk or cast a blight with an evil eye. Yet when a child fell sick with a fever that the priest's prayers could not break, when a farmer was afflicted with a painful affliction that the barber surgeon's bleeding could not cure, it was to the cunning woman's door that they would come, often at dusk, cloaked in secrecy and desperation. She was both a threat and a necessity, a figure of suspicion who became an object of desperate hope when all other options were exhausted. The Toad Doctor was a specialist within this tradition, a healer whose reputation was built upon her unique and fearsome command over this most potent of creatures. The range of ailments the Toad Doctor claimed to treat was specific, largely focused on conditions that were eruptive, swollen, or seen as a form of physical corruption. Chief among these was scrofula, a form of extrapulmonary tuberculosis that manifested as swollen, inflamed lymph nodes in the neck, which would often rupture and drain. It was known as the King's Evil because it was popularly believed that it could be cured by the touch of a rightful monarch. When the king's touch was unavailable or ineffective, the toad was the common person's alternative. The Toad Doctor also treated boils, abscesses, carbuncles, and even the terrifying buboes of the bubonic plague. Other applications included treatments for rheumatism, dropsy, edema, and warts. The methods used were varied, each a distinct ritual designed to channel the toad's inherent power. One of the most common and least invasive methods was the creation of a toad amulet. This was typically used for chronic conditions like scrofula or rheumatism. The Toad Doctor would take a large live garden toad and, in a process that was itself a guarded secret, kill the creature, often by pinning it to an anthill until the ants had consumed its flesh, leaving only the skeleton. More commonly, however, the toad was killed and then placed in a dry, airy spot, perhaps in the rafters of the cottage, until it had completely desiccated. It became a hard, dry, leathery husk, a mummified effigy of its living self. This dried toad would then be carefully wrapped in a piece of silk or linen. The material was important, adding its own layer of perceived value and efficacy, and sewn shut. This small bag was then given to the patient with strict instructions to wear it around their neck, with the toad resting against their bare skin. The magical principle was one of slow, sympathetic transfer. It was believed that as the toad's corpse continued to wither and decay within its silken shroud, the patient's ailment, the swollen glands of scrofula, the swollen joints of rheumatism, would likewise shrink, wither, and disappear. The toad's body was acting as a magical sponge, slowly and invisibly drawing the sickness out of the person and into itself. The cure was a process, a gradual rebalancing of forces between the patient and the amulet. A far more direct, dramatic, and gruesome method involved the application of a live toad as a form of living poultice. This was the preferred treatment for acute inflamed swellings like a painful boil or a plague bubo. Let us imagine the scene. A blacksmith lies in his cottage, delirious with fever, a large, angry purple bubo swelling in his groin. The family is terrified. They believe this is the token of the plague, a sure sign of imminent death. The priest has administered last rites, but the man's wife, refusing to give up hope, has made the secret journey to the Toad Doctor's hovel. The old woman arrives, carrying a small, damp sack from which a low croaking can be heard. She enters the sick room, her presence immediately changing the atmosphere from one of passive grief to one of active, fearful intervention. She would reach into her sack and pull out a large, struggling toad. With a firm grip, she would hold the toad's head and position its belly directly against the hot, inflamed surface of the bubo. The theory was that the toad, a creature of cold poison, would be instinctively drawn to the hot venom of the disease. The patient might cry out in fear or disgust at the cold, clammy contact. The toad doctor would then hold the creature in place, sometimes for hours, chanting low incantations or simply waiting in silence. According to the folklore of the cure, a successful application would result in a visible transfer. The toad would begin to swell, its body visibly expanding as it supposedly sucked the poison out of the bubo. It might tremble and shudder. Finally, in the ultimate sign of the cure's efficacy, the toad would die, sometimes even bursting, having become so engorged with the patient's sickness that it could not survive. The toad doctor would then discard the dead creature, often burying it with a specific ritual, and apply a fresh toad. This process would be repeated until the swelling began to subside, or until the patient died, in which case the disease was simply deemed too powerful for even the toad's magic. The psychological impact of this ritual on a desperate, pre-scientific family cannot be overstated. It was a tangible, visible battle being waged against the disease. It transformed a state of helpless waiting into a moment of dramatic, active intervention. They were doing something, fighting back with the darkest powers of nature. The most extreme form of toad medicine involved internal consumption. For diseases that were seen as a systemic poison, like smallpox or certain fevers, the toad's essence had to be taken into the body. This could be done in several ways. A dried toad could be ground into a fine powder using a mortar and pestle. This powder would then be mixed with wine, ale, or water and given to the sick person to drink. The idea was to fight the internal poison with a dose of the toad's own powerful venom, a form of proto-immunotherapy. In some even more horrifying accounts, a patient might be instructed to hold a live toad in their mouth, believing its breath or its secretions could combat the illness. The logic here is murky, but it seems to be an ultimate act of incorporating the creature's curative power into the very core of one's being. A fascinating and slightly more refined offshoot of toad medicine was the belief in the toadstone, or crapaudine, or buffonite. This was a magical jewel that was believed to grow inside the head of a very old toad. According to legend, to acquire the stone, one had to place the toad on a piece of red cloth, and the creature would obligingly spit out the jewel. In reality, the objects identified as toadstones were not jewels at all, but the fossilized palatal teeth of a prehistoric species of fish called lepidotes. These small, rounded and polished-looking fossils did vaguely resemble a stone one might imagine finding in a toad's head. The toadstone was considered one of the most powerful amulets available. It was worn in a ring or a pendant, and it was believed to have the power to detect poison. If brought near a poisoned drink, the stone would supposedly heat up, sweat, or change color, warning its wearer of the danger. It was a prized possession of nobles and kings who lived in constant fear of assassination. This belief elevated the toad from a mere medicinal tool to a source of magical talismanic power, its body a secret crucible for producing a gem of immense value. So was there any actual medical validity to these strange practices? From a modern scientific perspective, the answer is almost entirely no. Scrofula is caused by a bacterium and responds to antibiotics, not dried toads. The plague is a bacterial infection, and holding a toad to a bubo would have no effect on its progress. However, to dismiss the toad doctor as a complete fraud is to miss the nuances of her role and the surprising complexity of her primary tool. The skin secretions of toads are a complex chemical factory. They contain, among other things, substances like bufotenin, which can have hallucinogenic properties, and bufotalin, which has a digitalis-like effect on the heart. Other compounds have been shown to have mild anesthetic or anti-inflammatory properties. Is it possible that applying a toad to a painful boil might have had a slight temporary numbing effect? Perhaps. Is it possible that the psychological power of the ritual, the intense belief of the patient and their family in the cure, could have triggered a powerful placebo effect, reducing stress and modulating the body's immune response? Almost certainly. The placebo effect in this context would have been immense. The toad doctor did not just provide a remedy, she provided a narrative. She gave meaning to a meaningless suffering. Her ritual transformed the patient from a passive victim of disease into the hero of a mystical drama, a protagonist in a battle between the forces of sickness and the magical power of nature. This psychological intervention, this provision of hope and agency in a world defined by helplessness, was perhaps the most potent medicine she administered. She was not just treating a physical ailment, she was treating a spiritual crisis. The decline of the Toad Doctor was a slow and inevitable process, driven by the great intellectual and social shifts of the modern era. The scientific revolution and the Enlightenment championed a new mechanical view of the universe and the human body. Disease was no longer a magical intrusion, but a mechanical failure to be diagnosed and repaired. The professionalization of medicine in the 18th and 19th centuries created a new, licensed class of physicians who actively sought to stamp out their unlicensed, irregular competitors. The cunning woman, once a respected, if feared, part of the community, was increasingly marginalized, her practices dismissed as ignorant superstition, or worse, prosecuted as criminal quackery. The toad, stripped of its ancient symbolic horror by the clear light of biological classification, became just another amphibian. The magical, interconnected world that had given the Toad Doctor her power dissolved, and she dissolved with it. Yet, her story remains, a powerful and unsettling window into a lost world of belief. The Toad Doctor represents a profound human impulse, the refusal to suffer passively. In her strange, often repulsive practices, we see a desperate and creative attempt to impose order on the chaos of disease, to fight back against the darkness with the most potent symbols the culture could provide. Her work stands as a testament to a time when the world was alive with hidden meanings, when a cure could be found in the belly of a monster, and when the ugliest of creatures could be believed to hold the most beautiful of promises, the promise of healing. She was a healer of the fringe, a doctor of the ditch, and her strange, forgotten profession is a powerful reminder that the history of medicine is not a simple, linear march of progress, but a complex, fascinating, and often deeply bizarre journey of the human imagination in its endless struggle against mortality. We have walked in the filth of the city with the gong farmer and stood in the shadow of the gallows with the executioner's assistant. We have explored professions born of desperation, of superstition, and of grim necessity. But for our final journey, we must leave the common world behind. We must pass through the great stone gates of the palace, navigate the crowded courtyards, and enter the inner sanctum of the court. A world of gilded surfaces and venomous whispers, of profound power and absolute paranoia. For it is here, in the very heart of the kingdom, within the private chambers of the monarch himself, that we find what is arguably the single strangest, most counterintuitive, and most coveted job in history. It is a role whose title seems like a crude joke, whose duties appear indescribably demeaning, yet whose holder was often the most powerful and influential man in the entire realm, second only to the king himself. This was the world of the groom of the stool. The title itself is jarring, a collision of the regal and the repulsive. The word groom evokes a sense of high-status service, a gentleman attendant, but stool refers, with stark medieval directness, to the king's commode, his toilet. On the surface, the primary duty of the groom of the stool was to attend the king during his most private and vulnerable moments of defecation. He was the man who assisted the monarch with his bodily functions. He was responsible for providing the bowl, the water, and the towels for washing. He was the man who, in the starkest terms, wiped the royal backside. To our modern sensibilities, this sounds like the ultimate humiliation, a form of intimate servitude so degrading that it could only be fit for the lowest of servants. But to believe this is to fundamentally misunderstand the nature of power in the Tudor and Stuart courts. For in this world, proximity was power, access was everything, and no one on earth had more intimate, more private, or more unfiltered access to the monarch than the groom of the stool. His seemingly base duties were, in fact, the key that unlocked a door to unparalleled influence, a door that the greatest dukes and bishops of the land could only dream of entering. To understand how this role became so powerful, we must first strip away our modern revulsion and see the privy chamber through the eyes of the Tudor court. The king's toilet was not a small, hidden closet. It was the close stool, a lavish piece of furniture, It was essentially a portable toilet, a padded box, often upholstered in velvet and silk with a hinged lid covering a pewter or ceramic chamber pot below. It was kept in the king's private apartments, the privy chamber, a suite of rooms that was the nerve centre of the entire government. The act of the king using the close stool was not a hurried, private affair. It was a scheduled part of his day, a time when he was seated, stationary, and, most importantly, away from the clamour and ceremony of the public court. It was a moment of quiet contemplation, of vulnerability, a time when the great mask of majesty could be, for a moment, set aside. The groom of the stool's first and most official duty in this context was that of a chief medical observer. In an age before stethoscopes or blood tests, the primary method for diagnosing a person's health was the inspection of their bodily fluids and waste. The royal physicians relied heavily on the king's urine and excrement to gauge his health, to check the balance of his humours, and to look for signs of disease. The presence of blood, worms, or changes in colour and consistency could all signify a serious ailment. The groom of the stool was the man responsible for this daily inspection. He would carefully monitor the royal output. He was the first line of defense for the king's health, the man who would notice any change, any sign of trouble, and report it directly to the physicians. This role immediately elevated him far above a mere servant. He was a trusted guardian of the king's body natural, a key figure in the preservation of the monarch's life. This medical responsibility required a man of intelligence, discretion, and unwavering loyalty. This foundation of trust was built into the very origins of the office. The position seems to have been formally established under King Henry VII, the first Tudor monarch. Henry, who had won his throne through conquest at the Battle of Bosworth Field, lived in a state of constant, simmering paranoia. He was surrounded by potential rivals and assassins. He knew, with a pragmatist's chilling clarity, that a king was at his most vulnerable when he was physically incapacitated, undressed, or otherwise distracted. And no moment combined all three of these vulnerabilities more perfectly than his time on the close stool. The man who attended him in this moment could not be just anyone. It had to be his most trusted, most loyal, and most physically capable companion. The first grooms were therefore drawn from the ranks of the king's most intimate bodyguards, his esquires of the body, knights who were his friends and companions in arms. The role was born not of sanitation, but of security. The groom was there to guard the king's body at its most exposed, a human shield against a dagger in the back. This established, from the very beginning, that the holder of this office was a man of high birth, noble status, and proven personal loyalty to the king. It was under Henry VII's son, the larger-than-life King Henry VIII, that the office of Groom of the Stool reached its absolute zenith of power and influence. Henry VIII was a man who ruled through a powerful projection of personal magnetism, but who was also deeply insecure, narcissistic, and obsessed with loyalty. He craved genuine male companionship, a circle of trusted friends with whom he could hunt, joust, and speak freely. His grooms of the stool were chosen from this inner circle of minions. They were his friends first, and his attendants second. This friendship, combined with the unparalleled intimacy of their duties, transformed the role into one of the most powerful positions at court. The career of Sir William Compton, Henry VIII's first significant groom of the stool, is a perfect case study in this transformation. Compton was a close friend of Henry's from his youth. As groom, he was with the king constantly. He helped him dress in the morning and undress at night. He shared jokes with him, listened to his private fears, and attended to his most basic needs. This constant, unfiltered proximity gave Compton a level of influence that was the envy of every courtier. He became the ultimate gatekeeper. While great nobles might have to wait weeks for a formal audience with the king, Compton had the king's ear every single day. He could whisper a suggestion, pass along a message, or subtly praise a friend while the king was getting ready for a hunt or sitting on the close stool. He controlled the flow of informal information to the monarch. This access made him the nexus of the entire system of court patronage. Anyone who wanted anything from the king, a title, a grant of land, a lucrative office, a favourable legal judgment, knew that the surest and fastest route was through Sir William Compton. The great lords and bishops of the realm would come to Compton, cap in hand, offering him gifts, bribes, and political support in exchange for a quiet word in the king's ear. Compton became fantastically wealthy and powerful. He amassed a huge portfolio of lands and was appointed to dozens of other official positions. His power was not derived from any great office of state like Lord Chancellor or Lord Treasurer. It was derived purely from his personal, intimate relationship with the king. He was the living embodiment of the principle that personal favor trumped official rank. Furthermore, the groom of the stool evolved to become the king's personal treasurer and private secretary. The stool in his title began to take on a secondary meaning, referring not just to the commode, but to the entire suite of the king's private rooms, his office or chaise per se. The groom became the keeper of the privy purse, a special fund of cash that the king used for his personal, day-to-day expenses, away from the official scrutiny of the state exchequer. This was the king's gambling money, the funds he used for gifts to his mistresses, for rewarding his friends, or for secret political payments. The groom of the stool managed this entire shadow economy. He handled vast sums of money, kept the king's private accounts, and had immense discretionary power over these funds. He was also responsible for the king's private correspondence, reading and often drafting the king's most secret and personal letters. He knew the king's secrets, both financial and personal, better than any man alive, including, most likely, the king's own wives and ministers. The immense power of the office was matched only by its immense danger. The groom of the stool walked on a razor's edge. His influence was entirely dependent on the personal whim of an often volatile monarch. To fall out of favor was not just to lose a job, but potentially to lose one's head. The tragic fate of Sir Henry Norris, who succeeded Compton as groom of the stool, is a chilling testament to this peril. Norris was another of Henry's close friends, a man at the very center of court life. His position gave him intimate access not just to the king, but to the Queen, Anne Boleyn. When the king decided to destroy Anne in 1536, he needed to create a narrative of her adultery to justify her execution. Norris, because of his daily proximity to the Queen and his known courtly friendship with her, became an obvious target. He was accused, almost certainly falsely, of being one of her lovers. His intimacy, once the source of his power, now became the very evidence used to condemn him. Despite his protestations of innocence, he was arrested, tried, and beheaded on Tower Hill. A few days before the Queen, he was accused of cuckolding. His fall was a terrifying message to everyone at court. The closer you were to the sun, the more devastating the burn would be if you fell. The role continued to evolve after Henry VIII's death. His son, the boy king Edward VI, appointed his own grooms. But as a woman, Queen Elizabeth I could not, for reasons of decorum, have a male groom of the stool. The functions of the office, however, did not disappear. They were simply transferred to her most trusted female attendants, the ladies of the bedchamber. Women like her childhood governess, Cat Ashley, and her kinswoman, Lettice Knollys, filled the role of intimate confidant, gatekeeper, and personal secretary. They controlled access to the Queen in her privy chambers, and they wielded immense influence as a result. The principle remained the same, even if the gender of the office holder had changed. With the accession of the Stuart kings in the 17th century, the role of groom of the stool was restored, but it began a slow transformation from a hands-on, personal office into a more formal, political, and eventually ceremonial position. The holder was now always a great nobleman, a duke or an earl, for whom the title was a significant honor and a sign of his standing as a leading figure in the royal court. The physical duties, while perhaps still officially part of the role, were likely delegated to lower-ranking servants. The groom of the stool was now less of a personal friend and more of a chief minister for the household, the senior lord in charge of the entire department of the royal bedchamber. He still held immense power over access and patronage, but the raw, personal intimacy of the Tudor era began to fade, replaced by a more structured and bureaucratic form of influence. The final decline of the office was a direct consequence of the decline of absolute monarchy itself. As Parliament's power grew and the monarch's personal political power waned, the importance of informal, personal access to the king diminished. Government business was increasingly conducted through official channels and cabinet ministers, not through whispers in the privy chamber. the role became a pure sinecure, a prestigious title with a handsome salary but no real duties. The last person to hold the title of Groom of the Stool was James Hamilton, the Duke of Hamilton under King George III. By the reign of Queen Victoria, the title, with its embarrassing and by then archaic connotations, was seen as deeply unseemly. In a reflection of Victorian sensibilities, the office was formally abolished and replaced with the more dignified-sounding Master of the Robes. In the final analysis, the Groom of the Stool is one of the most revealing and significant roles in the history of courtly power. It is a perfect symbol of a world that operated on a fundamentally different set of principles than our own. It teaches us that in the intensely personal and paranoid world of the absolute monarch, power was not a function of one's official title on a government chart. It did not flow from being the head of the army or the judiciary. It flowed from the king's person. It was a radiant, almost physical energy, and the closer one could get to its source, the more of it one could absorb and wield. The Groom of the Stool was the man who stood closer than anyone. He was a man who turned a seemingly demeaning, servile task into the foundation of a spectacular career. He was the king's friend, his bodyguard, his nurse, his secretary, his banker, and his confidant, all rolled into one. He was a living paradox, a servant more powerful than the lords he served. His story is a powerful reminder that the true levers of power are often not the ones on public display, but are hidden away in the quiet, private, and most vulnerable chambers of the human heart. The man who held the chamber pot, in a very real sense, often held the keys to the entire kingdom. And so, our journey through the strange and shadowed alleyways of the medieval economy comes to an end. We have walked with the gong farmer into the city's foul depths, stood beside the sin-eater as he consumed the transgressions of the dead and felt the chill of the graveyard air with the resurrectionist. We have witnessed the quiet, desperate courage of the plague collector, the stoic suffering of the whipping boy, and the lonely, repetitive toil of the treadwheel laborer. We have seen a world of work so alien, so viscerally connected to the raw materials of life and death that it almost defies our modern comprehension. These are not merely curious anecdotes or historical footnotes. To dismiss them as such is to miss their profound significance. For these strange jobs were not aberrations. They were the very bedrock of their society. They were the dark, load-bearing pillars upon which the entire glittering edifice of the medieval world, its cathedrals, its castles, its kings, and its philosophers, was built. To truly understand this, we must look beyond the immediate grotesquerie of each task and see the fundamental anxieties they were created to address. These were jobs born of fear, the fear of filth, the fear of sickness, the fear of spiritual damnation, the fear of social chaos, and the fear of the unknown. They represent a society grappling with the limited tools at its disposal, with the inescapable, organic realities of human existence. The gong farmer and the rat catcher were soldiers in a war against chaos, a war to impose a fragile human order on an urban environment that perpetually threatened to devolve into a state of nature. The leech collector and the toad doctor reveal a society wrestling with an even greater fear, the terror of the body's betrayal, the inexplicable agony of sickness and disease. The sin-eater and the executioner represent a society grappling with the highest stakes of all, the fate of the soul and the maintenance of divine and earthly justice. The truth is that every society, no matter how advanced, produces its own forms of physical, moral, and psychological waste, and every society requires people to manage it. We may have pushed this labor to the margins, outsourced it to distant lands, or automated parts of it, but the fundamental need for individuals to perform the difficult, the dangerous, and the dishonorable work has not vanished. It has only changed its form. The strange jobs of the medieval past are not just relics of a superstitious and brutal age. They are a powerful and unsettling reminder of the hidden costs of civilization. They force us to ask a difficult question. Who are the gong farmers and the sin-eaters of our own world? And do we, like the medieval citizens who crossed the street to avoid them, prefer not to look them in the eye? And now, our journey is at an end. We return you to your time and your place, perhaps with the quiet understanding that the foundations of our own clean and orderly world may be resting on dark and strange labours we have simply chosen not to see.